The film begins with a black screen. A voice says, "I died when I was 28 years old."
I was 28 years old when I died.
With his sisters Mary, Gloria, and brother Roy, a young George Foreman rides in the back of a pickup truck. Nancy, their mother, sits in the front passenger seat. They are dropped in front of a dilapidated house. Nancy cuts a small hamburger into 4 pieces that night. Mary motions for George to wait just as he is about to eat his piece. Nancy then says grace but does not appear to be eating anything. After George finishes his piece, he remarks that he is so hungry that he could eat the table, and Mary offers him a piece of hers. The next day at school, George wears a shirt and pants with numerous holes, and his shoes are so worn that half his sock is visible. When the teacher asks a question, George's hand shoots straight up, but despite his appearance, the teacher does not call him. The teacher summons a black student with neatly coiffed hair and ironed clothes. George sits with his classmates for lunch, but he has nothing in front of him. He looks around as they eat sandwiches and chicken. One of his classmates makes fun of him for not having any food. He removes the skin from his chicken and throws it in the trash. He refers to George as poor man rather than foreman. The entire class laughs. George is overcome by rage. He charges at the student, punching him to the ground, dares him to mock him once more. When the teacher arrives, George flees. Cut to an older George walking the streets of Houston in an undesirable neighborhood. He runs into a friend who offers him a flask. George accepts it. They start following a drunk guy who staggers out of the bar. After a brief moment, they seize him, throw him to the ground, and search for his wallet. They don't find it, but they do discover a police badge. After all, the drunk guy isn't drunk. The sirens become louder, and George and his friends flee the scene. George runs in the opposite direction as his friend goes one way. The cop car pursues him. George takes cover beneath a raised house. The cop car pulls over, and the 2 officers start looking for George with a police dog. George thinks quickly. He notices the mud/poop dripping from the house pipes. He must smear mud/poop on his face in order to mask his scent and avoid the dog. It is effective. While walking home, George notices a Job Corps commercial. He goes to his mother's workplace, a diner, and talks about it with her. She dislikes it, but she supports him and begs him not to fight. Job Corps relocates him to California. He does well there and meets Desmond, a numbers whiz who has smuck in a flask. George discovers a surprise from his mother in his bag. It's a pair of brand new Converse sneakers. He notices that his shoes have been stolen after a day of training. He complains to Desmond at lunch, and then notices a guy wearing brand new sneakers that look exactly like his. George looks at him, and he returns his gaze. The thief then flees through the front door. George follows him around campus. George bursts through a dorm door and imprisons the man outside a window. Doc Broadus walks by and breaks up the fight. As the thief flees, George goes to get his shoes, while Doc questions him about the door. Doc helps George get into his car. Doc has 2 options: incarcerate George or release him. George begs not to be evicted. Doc seriously considers driving him to the train station. Instead, they arrive at the boxing gym. Doc gives George boxing gloves and a headgear. He fights another boxer who dances around the ring. George gets tired, and the boxer knocks him out with 1 punch. Those watching laugh. This really irritates George. That rage returns. George exits the ring and can knock a punching bag off the ceiling with 1 swing. Doc recognizes George's potential, and they begin training. Doc teaches him how to feel the steps. Consider using his mind. Use his advantages to his advantage. He teams up with Doc's trainer and promotions guy. George is able to contact his mother, who is disappointed to learn that he is fighting once more. It's not a fight, according to George. It's a game with rules. George wins a few fights, and Doc says it's too late for him to compete in the Olympics in a year, but he'll be ready in 5 years. George is dismayed to hear this. George is at the Olympics 1 year later against all odds. He defeats Russian fighter Jonas Sepulus to win the gold medal. Foreman, Foreman, the crowd yells. George is feeling fantastic. George is given a small American flag, which he waves. He proudly displays his gold medal in Houston. His friend, however, is unimpressed because he believes George has become accustomed to representing a country that does not value the black community. This serves as motivation for George, who goes on a winning streak. He meets Paula at the train station, and they begin dating and eventually marry. George advances to the title fight against Joe Frazier. Commentators believe George will be carried out of the arena on a stretcher. Desmond is among those present. George, however, wins the fight by knocking out Frazier. He is the world's new heavyweight champion. At a celebration, George offers to make Desmond his money man if he stops drinking. Desmond accepts without hesitation. Upstairs, George discovers a lovely lady in his room. He doesn't force her to leave, and they end up spending the night together. Muhammad Ali is on TV, insulting George and declaring that he will fight him anywhere at any time. George invites his entire family to his mansion for his daughter's birthday celebration. George makes cooking suggestions and is estranged from his wife. Before lunch, George claims responsibility for the food, while his mother insists on thanking God. Mary, his sister, announces that she and her husband are expecting a child. Desmond says he's investing George's money in safe stocks while Paula answers a phone call, but no one answers. In private, Paula confronts George. She is aware of all of his affairs and wishes for him to come clean. George wants to concentrate on his upcoming fight with Ali. In the hotel lobby, Ali brags in front of a crowd of sports columnists. This is overheard by George. One man approaches George and inquires about his side of the story. George gets in Ali's face, but eventually walks away. One bystander suggests that George place Ali in the morgue. Ali's strategy during the fight is to lean up against the ropes and take punches. This exhausts George. George becomes exhausted as he goes round and round. Throughout the fight, Ali keeps his mouth open. Ali eventually knocks out a tired George and wins the fight. George calls his daughter, and Paula demands that he sign the divorce papers. Nancy tries to console George and is perplexed as to why he fired his trainer and promotions manager. George rants about Ali's winning strategy. To regain respect, George performs a boxing exhibition in which he attempts to knock out 5 fighters in one day. Ali is a sports announcer who taunts George in the ring. They can communicate. In the locker room, George agrees to return to his roots as a true fighter rather than a showman. Mary and the baby are in critical condition at the hospital. Nancy wishes to pray, but George declines. Instead, he goes outside and begs God to take George instead of Mary and the baby if he lets Mary and the baby live. Mary and the baby are in excellent condition in the morning. George is the name of the baby. George's next opponent is Jimmy Young. George injures Young severely, but is unable to finish him off. He was knocked out in round 12 and lost by unanimous decision. George begins to hear voices in the locker room. He passes out, falls, and hits his head. He expresses his desire to live to God. When George awakens, he finds everyone huddled around him. He stands up against their wishes and yells hallelujah as he sprays himself with shower water. He preaches at church about how much he enjoys fighting, but now he's going to give his life to God. He mimisses Mary, a young woman in the crowd. Doc tries to persuade George to return to the ring, but he says he's done fighting. He shows up at Ali's mansion, and rather than asking for a rematch, as Ali suspected, he asks for forgiveness. Ali, in his sarcastic manner, gives George a hard time, but they part as friends with mutual respect. George begs Paula's forgiveness and promises to be there for his children. On a street corner, he begins preaching. Hecklers want George to return to the ring, but George vows to die before doing so again. He takes Mary out to lunch, and she is impressed with how much he has changed. He shows her a dilapidated church he wants to restore and begins his life as an ordained minister. 7 years later, he is approached by a grandmother seeking assistance for her grandson, who has gotten into some trouble on the streets. She wants George to teach him to box, but George is adamant that boxing isn't the solution. Later, George sees on TV that his grandson has been arrested for burglary. George knows that if he had met that young man where he was instead at where George wanted him to be, he could have changed that young boy's life. George meets Desmond on a street corner in a rundown gym. George intends to transform it into a youth center where young people can go instead of the streets. Des says he'll call the bank and transfer some funds to make it possible. Desmond takes out a flask and drinks the last of it after George walks away. The youth center is a success. Everyone enjoys going, and George is aware that he is making a difference in his community. The power then goes out. The secretary informs George that the power company informed her that the bill was not paid. When George and Mary go to the bank, the employee informs them that Desmond made poor decisions, and George now has nothing to his name. Nancy visits George's church. She informs him that she is aware that he has the entire town searching for Desmond, who has fled. Nancy begs him not to become enraged. Desmond is discovered in a bar by George. He bolts. George pursues him. Desmond admits to having spent all of the money. George appears in a barbecue sauce commercial. He disposes of everything he owns. He continues to preach, but it has no effect. George is forced to return to boxing. Mary does not want him to go down that road. She awakens in the middle of the night and informs George that she has had a vision. She believes it is a gift from God. She considered George to be the heavyweight champion. He goes up to Doc, who is training another boxer. Doc makes fun of George because he has gained a lot of weight. Doc says if George loses 265 pounds, he'll start training with him again. George begins his work. He receives a new punching bag. Mary feeds their children pancakes and George oatmeal, and George runs alongside his son. It's difficult, and neighbors are concerned when he holds himself up against a tree, but George manages to lose 265 pounds. Doc believes George has a chance with some new tricks. Although many thought George's return was a mistake, he defeated Steve Zosky in his first fight. People begin to take him seriously, and the audience cheers for him. He is winning more fights, and the commentators are rooting for him. George sells his name and face rights for various products while continuing his comeback. He adopts a friendly demeanor in order to appear approachable. He's no longer arrogant or disrespectful. He makes everyone laugh when he appears on Johnny Carson's show. His fighting style has even changed. His footing has changed, and he is now more relaxed. His lack of stamina was caused by a great deal of nervous tension. This is no longer a problem. The employee at the bank informs George and Mary that his financial problems have been resolved. The George Foreman Grill will provide enough income for future generations. But despite the fact that George will not have to fight again, he is dissatisfied. He understands that Mary's vision must be realized. He worked hard in the ring. At the age of 45, George has the opportunity to compete for the World Championship against Michael Moore. Moore is 19 years younger. George is dressed in the same trunks that he wore when he fought Ali. George is the underdog this time. They have a match, and it is a test. This time, however, George uses his head, as Doc taught him years ago. He takes advantage of his advantages. Moore's flaws are exposed and used against him. George remarks that he had to be knocked down to the bottom to see what was already there, proving that you can accomplish the impossible. George wins by knockout. He falls to his knees to praise God. George retires and resumes his preaching. Since he sold his rights to the George Foreman Grill for $187 million, his youth center has been financially secure in perpetuity. If one of them falls, they all fall, he says of his sons, and if one of them rises, they all rise. Ali and George remain friends and communicate on a daily basis for the rest of their lives. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below, and if you liked the video, please like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you in the next video.